The sun sank low over Lexington, Kentucky, painting the streets with a golden hue that softened the edges of the city. Officer Mark Anderson adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes lazily scanning the quiet traffic. His partner, Emily Carter, sat beside him, her pen tapping against a notepad as she reviewed their earlier call. They were parked on Ashland Avenue, where modest family homes gave way to sleek upscale condos, a neighborhood at the crossroads of two worlds. Mark's gaze suddenly locked onto a black car gliding past them, its polished exterior gleaming in the evening light. Behind the wheel sat a poised African-American woman in a tailored navy suit, her hair styled with precision, her posture a picture of confidence. Something about her composure unsettled Mark. "Look at that," he muttered, his tone laced with disdain. "Fancy car. Bet she's up to something." Emily glanced up from her notes. "She's not speeding or breaking any laws," she said cautiously. "What's the problem?" Mark ignored her, his hand moving to the switch for the patrol car's lights. "Let's find out," he said with a smirk, pulling onto the road behind the vehicle. The driver signaled and slowed, pulling to the curb with calm deliberation. From the rear window, Emily noticed her shoulders stiffen, a subtle tension that spoke volumes. As Mark parked and stepped out, Emily hesitated, her instincts warning her. "Mark, this doesn't feel right," she whispered, hurrying after him. "You don't even have probable cause." "Stay back, rookie," Mark snapped, his hand brushing his holster. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I know a suspect when I see one." The car window lowered, revealing the driver's composed but wary face. Grace Williams met the officers' gazes with quiet strength. "Good evening, officers," Grace said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Mark leaned in, his shadow falling over her. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her question. Grace's hands moved carefully, retrieving her documents and placing them on the dashboard before handing them over. Emily noticed a faint tremor in Grace's fingers and felt her unease grow. Something was wrong, not with Grace, but with Mark. His manner had shifted, becoming aggressive without cause. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Williams?" Mark asked, scanning her documents with a sharp tone. Grace tilted her head slightly, her voice steady. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Mark's lip curled in mockery. "Must be some meeting to be driving a car like this." Emily felt her stomach knot. The tension was palpable, drawing the attention of passers-by. She stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Mark, she's cooperating. Let's not escalate." But Mark was already pulling on the car door handle. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his grip tightening. Grace's composure faltered for a moment. "Is there a reason for this?" she asked, calm but firm. "I said step out," Mark growled, yanking the door open. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt with deliberate movements and stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. Emily's heart raced as she watched Mark grab Grace's arm, his grip unnecessarily rough. Grace stumbled, steadying herself against the doorframe. "That's enough," Emily blurted, stepping forward. Her voice wavered, but she didn't back down. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Mark shot her a glare. "Stay out of this, rookie." Grace straightened her jacket, meeting Mark's glare with a steady resolve. "This is harassment, Officer Anderson," she said. "I know my rights." Mark leaned in closer, his smirk cold and condescending. "Out here, rights are what I say they are." Grace's jaw tightened, but she refused to look away. Emily, standing just a few feet away, felt a swirl of emotions: fear, anger, and an undeniable sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was something far more sinister. Mark's grip on Grace's arm tightened as he shoved her against the car. Her bag slipped from her shoulder, its contents scattering: keys, a phone, a small notepad. Grace exhaled sharply, keeping her composure. "This is unnecessary," Grace said, her tone clipped but controlled. "I've complied with everything you've asked." Mark crouched, rummaging through her belongings without permission. His actions were deliberate, as though searching for something to justify his behavior. "What's a woman like you doing with a car like this?" he muttered. Emily stepped closer, her fists clenched. "Mark, this isn't protocol. We don't have probable cause to search her things." Mark didn't even look up. "You've got a lot to learn, rookie. This is how you keep the streets clean." Grace's voice hardened. "Officer Anderson, you are violating my rights. You have no reason to search my property." Mark stood, holding one of her credit cards like evidence. You don't get to lecture me, lady. You're in my town now. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmurs growing louder as several people pulled out their phones to record. Grace noticed, but kept her focus on Mark. Emily's chest tightened as she saw Mark step back to the car, slipping his hand into his pocket. Her pulse quickened when he pulled out a small plastic bag, a bag that hadn't come from Grace's belongings. Mark, Emily hissed, her voice barely a whisper. What are you doing? Mark ignored her. Leaning into the car, he slipped the bag under the driver's seat. Straightening up, he turned to the crowd, holding the bag aloft as though it were a trophy. Well, well, he announced loudly, his voice dripping with triumph. Looks like we've got a little drug situation here. Grace's eyes widened, shock and anger flashing across her face. That's not mine, she said firmly, stepping toward him. You just planted that in my car. Mark smirked. That's a nice story, Miss Williams, but it's not going to hold up. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, disbelief rippling through them. Phones captured every moment as the weight of the situation bore down. The air seemed to thicken as Emily's pulse quickened, her stomach churning with the weight of what she had just witnessed. She had seen it, clear as day, Mark slipping that incriminating bag into Grace's car. The truth clawed at her, screaming to be spoken, yet her feet stayed rooted, and her voice felt trapped in her tightening throat. Grace's gaze shifted to Emily, her eyes piercing with a silent plea. You saw what he did, she said, her voice steady yet tinged with desperation. Please, say something. Emily's chest felt heavy, her conscience waging war against her fear. She could feel Mark's gaze boring into her, daring her to open her mouth. His silent message was clear. Stay quiet or you'll regret it. But no matter how much she tried, Emily couldn't unsee what she'd seen. The memory replayed in her mind. Mark's calculated movements, the bag slipping from his fingers. Her father's words, a mantra since childhood, whispered to her now. Integrity isn't easy, but it's what makes you good. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke. Mark, she said, trembling but resolute, this isn't right. Mark's head snapped toward her, his face darkening with fury. You don't know what you're talking about, he hissed. Keep your mouth shut. Grace stood tall, her composure unbroken despite the venom directed at her. You can't intimidate your way out of this, she said, her tone unwavering. I know exactly what's happening here. And so does she. Mark stepped closer to Grace, his hand resting on his holster in a way that made Emily's blood run cold. You think you're untouchable, he snarled. Driving around in a fancy car, acting like you're better than everyone else? That's enough, Emily blurted, her voice cutting through the tension. She hadn't intended to speak so loudly, but her heart was pounding, and she couldn't back down now. You're crossing the line. The crowd that had gathered was larger now, their murmurs a low hum of unease. Phones were raised, recording every word, every movement. Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the onlookers before returning to Grace. Grace inhaled deeply, her gaze steady. Thank you for speaking up, she said to Emily, her voice calm. But this isn't over. Something shifted in Emily then. A spark of courage that had been buried under layers of fear. For the first time, she felt strong enough to stand her ground. Mark's lips curled into a sneer as he turned his attention back to Grace. His voice dropped to a growl, low enough that only she could hear. You think these people will help you? You think you're smarter than me? Grace didn't flinch. Her voice, steady and sharp, carried more weight than a shout ever could. I don't think Officer Anderson. I know. Mark's composure cracked, but only for a heartbeat. His mask of arrogance slipped back into place as he pulled the handcuffs from his belt. You're under arrest, he announced, stepping toward Grace. For possession of a controlled substance. Emily's breath hitched. The moment of truth was upon her. Her father's words echoed louder than ever. If you don't stand up for what's right, you're just as guilty as the one doing wrong. No, the word escaped her lips before she could stop it, cutting through the growing noise like a blade. She stepped between Mark and Grace, raising her hands. This isn't right and you know it. Mark's face turned crimson with rage. Move, rookie, he barked. Don't make me report you for insubordination. Emily stood firm, her voice trembling but determined. You planted that evidence. I saw you. I'm not going to be a part of this. A gasp rippled through the crowd, their shock palpable. Grace's eyes softened as she looked at Emily, her voice carrying gratitude. Thank you. Mark's fury boiled over. He jabbed a finger into Emily's chest. You're done, he growled. Do you hear me? I'll make sure you never wear that badge again. Emily's knees threatened to give way, but she squared her shoulders. If that's what it takes to do the right thing, then so be it. The tension reached its breaking point as Grace, sensing the moment, spoke up. Officer Anderson, she said, her tone commanding, you might want to reconsider your next move. Mark laughed bitterly. Oh yeah? And why's that? Grace moved slowly, deliberately, her hand reaching into her jacket pocket. Both officers stiffened, but she didn't waver. With a measured motion, she pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. The shiny insignia inside caught the light. My name, she announced, her voice ringing clear, is Captain Grace Williams. I'm the new commanding officer for this precinct. Silence. For a long moment no one spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone. Mark's face drained of color as he stared at the badge, his confidence crumbling. That's not possible, he stammered. You can't be. Grace cut him off. You didn't even bother to ask before deciding I was a criminal, did you? But it shouldn't matter who I am. Everyone deserves respect. Not judgment. Not harassment. The murmurs of the crowd erupted into shouts, some cheering, others demanding justice. The phone stayed raised, capturing every second of Mark's unraveling. Emily felt the weight of the moment crashing over her. Grace turned to her, her expression soft. Officer Carter, she said, you did the right thing. It's not easy, but it's what counts. Tears pricked at Emily's eyes as she whispered, I should have done it sooner. I'm sorry. Grace nodded. You did it when it mattered. Mark's voice broke through the commotion, desperate and trembling. Captain, I can explain. No, Grace's sharp tone silenced him. You can't. What you did today is a betrayal of everything this badge stands for. Hand over your weapon and badge. You're suspended, effective immediately. Mark's hands shook as he unclipped his holster, his glare filled with resentment. You don't know what it's like out here, he spat. I've been protecting these streets for 20 years. Grace's gaze didn't waver. Protecting, she repeated. Is that what you call this? How many lives have you ruined, Mark? How many people have you framed to feed your ego? The crowd roared louder now, their cries of anger and demand for accountability filling the air. Emily's eyes darted to the growing throng. This was no longer just about Mark. It was about something much bigger. The system had allowed officers like him to act unchecked for far too long. Grace stepped forward, her voice cutting through the rising noise like a blade. This isn't just about me, she declared, turning her gaze to the gathered crowd. This is about accountability, about ensuring no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Mark's face flushed with anger, his steps heavy as he closed the distance between them. You think you're some kind of hero, he sneered. You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind a desk while I'm out risking my life. Grace arched an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. And you think that justifies planting evidence? Intimidating and degrading innocent people. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of conviction. You're not risking your life, Mark. You're destroying others. Emily's chest tightened as she stood frozen in place, caught in the gravity of the exchange. She had always known there were cracks in the system, but seeing them exposed so starkly shook her to her core. Grace's tone softened as she turned toward Emily. Officer Carter, she said gently, her eyes meeting Emily's. I know how hard this is for you, but what you did today took courage. Don't lose that. Emily managed a slow nod, her voice barely a whisper. I won't. Mark still clutched his badge, his expression teetering between resentment and desperation. You're making a mistake, Captain, he spat. People like you don't last in this job. Grace stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. People like me, she echoed, her voice steady. You mean people who believe in justice? Equality? If that's a mistake, it's one I'll gladly make. The crowd erupted, their cheers drowning out Mark's protests. Grace turned to one of the bystanders holding a phone aloft. Thank you for recording this, she said firmly. Make sure it gets out. Mark's face twisted in fury. You're throwing me under the bus for optics. This is all for show. Grace didn't flinch. No, Mark. This is accountability, Something you clearly don't understand. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. Grace stood tall, her presence commanding as Mark's bravado began to crumble. Reluctantly, he handed over his badge and holster, his shoulders slumping under the weight of what had just transpired. Emily's emotions churned, a storm of relief, guilt, and a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. Another patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out, their eyes darting between the crowd and the tense scene. Grace waved them over, her voice clear and decisive. "Officers, escort Mr. Anderson to the precinct. He's suspended pending a full investigation." Mark's face reddened further. "You can't be serious. This is my precinct, my team." Grace didn't even glance at him. "Not anymore." The crowd cheered louder as the officers led Mark away, their voices a mixture of support for Grace and cries for justice. Grace turned to face the onlookers, her voice rising above the din. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone resolute. "Today, we've taken a stand against corruption and prejudice. But it doesn't stop here. It's up to all of us to demand accountability and ensure this system serves everyone." The applause swelled, a wave of energy and determination sweeping through the crowd. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, realizing the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about Grace or Mark. It was about the community reclaiming faith in those meant to protect them. As the scene settled, Grace approached Emily, her expression softening. "You did the right thing today," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." Emily's voice wavered as she replied, "I was scared. I didn't know if I'd lose everything." Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You didn't lose anything that matters. Integrity is what defines us, not the badge." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but she felt a pride she hadn't known since she first joined the force. For the first time, she understood the true meaning of the oath she had taken. A local news crew arrived, cameras rolling as they approached. Grace took a steadying breath, knowing the moment would shine brighter under the spotlight. Turning to the camera, her voice was calm but firm. "What happened here today is a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. Change takes moments like this." As the crew captured her every word, Emily stepped back, letting Grace take the lead. She glanced at the dispersing crowd, their determination lingering in the air. For Emily, this was a new chapter, one where she could finally stand by the values she'd sworn to uphold. For Grace, it was a chance to repair a fractured system from within. For the community, it was a spark, a beacon of hope that could ignite a movement for justice. The sirens faded as Mark's car disappeared down the road. Standing side by side, Grace and Emily braced for what lay ahead, ready to fight for a better tomorrow.